Ireland, Brexit, and anything else that you want to call in and put to our panellists, who today are Claire Hanna, the SDLP MP for Belfast South, who will be joining us very shortly. So Christopher Chope is here, the Conservative MP for Christchurch and a former minister in the government of Margaret Thatcher and John Major. Hilary Schan is with me, the co-chair of Momentum, and Ryan Shorthouse, the founder and think tank of the centre-right Bright Blue think tank. 0345 6060 973, the number to put your question to our panellists.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Ben Kentish. This is LBC.
Right, let's come straight to your calls. Claire's going to be joining us very shortly, but Christopher, Hilary and Ryan are already here and waiting to take your questions. Naomi in Sheffield is going to kick us off this evening. Naomi, very good evening to you.
Hi, Ben.
Hello, how are you?
Well, I'm good.
Good. Your question to the panel.
Yeah, it was, does anybody still want to call Rishi Sunak weak today? Because even though I'm a Labour member, I think he has played an absolute blinder. And it's given me optimism, and I have not had that since 23rd of June 2016.
Interesting. So, Christopher, does anyone want to call Rishi Sunak weak? Naomi is convinced by his deal. Are you?
Well, I've certainly never called him in weak, and I'm delighted that Naomi thinks it's a good deal, and I think most people seem to think that it is an unexpectedly good deal, and obviously everybody's looking over the small print and the legal texts. But at the moment, it looks as though what is being described as a good deal is actually a good deal. And what I think it brings into focus is how appalling the original deal was that Mrs May negotiated and which dear Boris had to inherit as the price of being able to get Brexit across the line. So enormous progress has been made, and I think Boris has been vindicated because he said that he'd sign up to this because there was no alternative, but that in the end, time would show that the Northern Ireland Protocol wasn't going to work and it would need to be replaced.
Well, how does Rishi Sunak having to spend countless hours negotiating a deal to undo the damage and solve the problems that Boris Johnson's deal did, how does that vindicate Boris Johnson?
Because it wasn't going to be possible to spend all these hours, you say probably many months, negotiating the Northern Ireland arrangements. It wasn't going to be possible to do that if we wanted to get Brexit done on the 31st of January 2020, which is what was achieved. And I think it was always going to be very complicated, but it was made more complicated by the sellouts that we delivered back in 2018 when Mrs May over the Christmas seemed to be completely taken by surprise and folded and abandoned our best interests. So it's taken a bit of time to recover from that, but I think Rishi's done a good job.
Hilary, is Rishi Sunak weak? Does this disprove the claim that Keir Starmer and others in Labour have been making about him?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I don't think you can really define strength by having had to clean up the mess of consecutive failed Tory prime ministers being held hostage by the DUP and the ERG again. And having to kind of grovel around and, as you say, spend hours negotiating on this. So, yeah, although progress may have been made, I don't think you can really define that as strength in a Prime Minister.
Is this potentially a turning point, though, for Rishi Sunak? Is this it's going to be seen, I think, as a big success? Do you worry, as presumably a Labour supporter, that actually this could be a turning point when it comes to the polls ahead of the next election?
No, not at all, because I think, when you actually look at the polling of the British public at the moment and in terms of what their priorities are, I mean, Brexit has fallen right behind, in comparison to a few years ago. I think about 15% of people are now saying it's a top priority for them. What people actually want to be talking about is the fact that inflation is so high, wages aren't serving workers, people aren't able to feed their kids, they're not able to heat their homes. Those are the priorities of the British public. And, the economic state that we're in is down to this failed Tory government, and I don't think this is going to be enough to make up for that.
Ryan, I wonder what you've made of today's events.
Well, I think the ongoing issue with our relationship with the EU is basically between having sovereignty and frictionless trade, and they're the kind of two poles. And if you go to more frictionless trade, then you have less sovereignty. And I think what I agree with Sir Christopher Chope in one sense, which is I do think in a way this is superior to the deal that was negotiated by Theresa May, of course, which kept Northern Ireland within the customs union. This, keeps Northern Ireland out of the customs union, but has the frictionless trade on goods with the new green system. So to me, the real and tangible detrimental impacts of the protocol in recent years on Northern Ireland have been very apparent and very real. And so I think this will reduce it. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It also paves the way for more improved relationships with the EU on economic matters. Of course, it's not perfect sovereignty because the ECJ still will have oversight over single market rules. But I think nobody can win perfectly in this situation. It has to be compromises. And I think actually Rishi has done quite an impressive and important negotiation. And a lot of people will be saying, gosh, look at this. Northern Ireland is in the single market. But, there is a degree of control with the so-called Stormont lock on the goods aspect. But nonetheless, it's sort of, in a great way, it would be great if Great Britain was in the single market and had some kind of veto or block as well. So I think Northern Ireland's got quite a good deal.
Let's put that to Christopher. Claire Hanna, SDLP MP, is with us. Claire, come to you in a moment. I just want to put that to Christopher, though. This idea that Northern Ireland being in the single market is a huge success. Why is it a success for Northern Ireland to have access to the single market? Why is that a success when the rest of the country not having access to the single market was something that so many Brexiteers campaigned for?
Well, it's all to do with the border between the north and the south, and the convention that you're not going to have a hard border there, and therefore you've got to enable there to be cross-border trade with the minimum amount of restriction and regulation. And that's been going on for years, and nobody wanted to put up a hard border, and that could have been something that the EU would put up in order to protect their single market. They decided not to do that. And this arrangement, which Rishi has come up with, I think fairly provides safeguards for the United Kingdom to defend our single market, whilst at the same time enabling the European Union to protect the interests of its own single market. And there's a sort of an overlap between those two single markets within the Irish context, because nobody wants to have a hard border.
Okay, we'll come back to that, I suspect, a little later. Claire Hanna is with us, the SDLP MP for Belfast South. Claire, thank you for joining us. The question from Naomi was, would anyone dare to call Rishi Sunak weak, given the agreement that he's delivered today?
Well, I've just come from the comments and apologies for being late. And I did commend Rishi Sunak. This is real progress. He has taken a considerably more constructive approach than his predecessors. And frankly, I don't know if Naomi is in Northern Ireland, but people in Northern Ireland have been stuck in a very exhausting and polarising loop for the last few years. I think a lot of the critique of the protocol has been overplayed, and it is important to remind people that a majority of voters or a majority of parties and a majority of business representatives welcome single market access and the protocol. We're all delighted to see reduced frictions caused by Brexit and easier trading, so that this is very welcome indeed. But you've hit the nail on the head about our unique dual market access, and Northern Ireland, it is no secret, has had a sluggish and unproductive economy for decades, and this is a real opportunity, but it will need the government to loudly champion that access and Northern Ireland as a destination for investment. But it will also need a restored executive, and it will need focus on skills and infrastructure and all of the other components that are going to be
all eyes effectively now on the DUP to see how they respond.
Yes, I think so, and I think it's clear that there are sensible people within the DUP who see the progress of this deal and who would like to take yes for an answer. Unfortunately, it has to be said, there has been an outsized prominence to a lot of negative voices within the DUP and even further to their right, who have zero interest in a deal and zero interest in consensus. And I think it has frustrated people that they have been given the mic so much over the last few years. But yes, all eyes are on the DUP. It's a lengthy document. I've been chipping away at it for the last couple of hours, but it's appropriate that parties in the DUP, including the DUP, are given time to absorb it. But really, people need governance, they need progress, and this is absolutely the basis on which to do that.
OK, Naomi, thank you for your call. That's Naomi in Sheffield. Let's go to William in Edinburgh now. William, we talked a little bit about the single market. Your question is on that. Good evening.
Good evening. Yes,
what's your question to the panel?
My question to the panel is a very, very simple, straight one. But if Northern Ireland are effectively in the single market, then why aren't the rest of the UK?
OK, William, thank you. Ryan, is there going to be pressure, do you think, for other regions, in fact the whole country, to perhaps be given the sort of access that Northern Ireland has been under this deal?
Well, I think, as has been explained, that dual market access is really beneficial for Northern Ireland. Look, the reason why most people, why we came out of the single market was because you have to accept freedom of movement to be a member of it. And that was a kind of prevailing reason why a lot of people, not the only reason, but a prevailing reason why people voted for Brexit, which is they wanted control over immigration and to end free movement. I think some people within the single market have an emergency brake option if they feel there is a compelling case that immigration is too high. Some people in the UK would argue that, but probably some people in the EU would say, actually, no, it isn't too high. But I think that's in very extreme circumstances, has rarely been used. But the fundamental thing is, my impression of public understanding of the single market is that probably most people would accept most of the rules, and that would be very beneficial for the economy. But the kind of sticking point is the lack of control over immigration. And I think, my personal view is that if Cameron had got more in terms of control over migration back during the negotiation prior to the referendum, maybe the country would have tilted towards Remain. So I think the main issue with the single market is freedom of movement. But I think, I'm broadly pro-immigration, but having no control over migration, I think, is a problem. And I think it is damaging to consensus for the EU or support for the EU from other neighbouring countries as well. So I think the EU over time should be more kind of responsive to people's concerns over freedom of movement and see more flexibility, because I think certainly that would help make the case for the UK to re-enter the single market. But until that time, I don't think there's a chance.
Hilary, should the government, Rishi Sunak's government, be looking to enter the single market?
Well, I mean, the answer to the question is that the reason it can't be is because the Tory party will never allow it through. And so, we have to look at the extent of the Brexit negotiations has always been what the Prime Minister of the time, the Conservative Prime Minister of the time, can negotiate with his own party. This has always been a Conservative psychodrama from the very beginning, when David Cameron, was bending to the pressures of having UKIP on the rise. So
Keir Starmer's also ruled it out, though. It's not just a Conservative issue. Keir Starmer also says Labour would not look to re-enter the single market.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is exactly that's not something we're calling for. That's not something the Labour Party is calling for.
Is it a mistake, do you think, for Keir Starmer to say that?
I think that he's right to take that stand at the moment. I don't think there's an appetite for that at the moment. And what we need to be talking about is the broader economic issues of the day. It's like I said before, this is actually, I know this has, come to fruition because of this deal now, but it isn't the priorities of the British people. We are still in an economic crisis caused by this disastrous Tory government, who managed to sink the economy in a weekend last year. And we are still recovering from that. And at the end of the day, these are not the issues that are going to fix that, and these are not the issues that are going to help working people in this country.
Christopher, just briefly, do you want to comment on that point about the economy?
Well, I think the economy it has gone through a rough time, and I'm looking forward to the budget on the 15th.
Hilary says it's your fault, your and your party's fault.
Well, I think it to an extent it is the fault, because I think we allowed inflation to get out of control, but that was made a lot worse by what's happened in Ukraine. So I'm not saying that the government is blameless about this, but I think it would be ridiculous to suggest that all the fault which we got with the economy at the moment is down to the government.
Hilary?
I mean, it's just, I mean, to say it's gone through a bit of a rough time, could that be any more of an understatement? As I said, the economy was crashed over a weekend, and look at what's happened since. You've got oil and gas companies making record profits while we pay more for energy. You've got banks raking in millions while our mortgage rates go up. That was all happened as a direct result of the mini budget, which sank the economy and has had a disastrous effect on working people in this country, and hence why we are seeing these unprecedented levels of strike action in the country. Working people are pushing back, and this is what I'm saying, is that yes, we may spend time today talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol, which of course is important, but in terms of what is really going to affect workers of this country and the working class of this country, it is the economy, and that's what we need to be talking about.
OK, we'll hear Claire's answer to that question in just a moment. You listen to LBC. This is Cross Question. I'm Ben Kentish. The time now, 8:18.
This is LBC.
Leo, mate.
8:21 is the time. With me in the studio for Cross Questions, Claire Hanna, the SDLP MP for Belfast South, Conservative MP for Christchurch, Sir Christopher Chope, Hilary Schan, the co-chair of Momentum, and Ryan Shorthouse, the founder and chief executive of the think tank Bright Blue. William had called in to ask the panel whether they thought that other parts of the United Kingdom should be given the same access to the EU and its single market that Northern Ireland has under Rishi Sunak's New Deal. Claire, we didn't come to you on this one. Do you think that other parts of the UK will now be clamouring for a similar sort of arrangement?
Well, look, it seems to be like a bit of a no-brainer, notwithstanding the political reasons that people said they voted against it. I sit on the UK Trade and Business Commission, which is representatives of all parties in Westminster, and takes evidence, week after week from different sectors who are crying out for the sort of access that, in fact, Northern Ireland should have after after this. The economic outlook has been bleak for the UK. No doubt there are global factors around energy and around Ukraine, but it is very clear that I think the UK has the slowest growth in the OECD is down there with Russia. As an aside, Ireland is at the very top of that, and that's creating a dynamic for many people in Northern Ireland as well. But in real terms, it feels like it isn't working for people. What wealth is there is concentrated in a very small number of places. Things aren't working. People can't keep up with the cost of living, and public services
that's true. Many parts of Scotland, many parts
aren't there.
Of Wales.
Absolutely, who also don't have access. So if it is about growth and if it is about improving people's economic circumstances and opportunities, then to me it is a no-brainer to regularise and improve your relationship with your closest and largest trading partner. I think the arrangement today is an important step on that. It just restores a bit of rationality to that. It takes some of the poison and tension that some small numbers were injecting into that relationship out, and I hope it creates an opportunity for everybody. I don't want to see a lamb farmer in Wales or a seafood producer in Scotland suffering any more than I wish to protect those in Northern Ireland. But what I will say, and that's the region I represent, that at the moment is an opportunity for us, and we want to take full advantage of it.
Christopher, just finally on this, if the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government comes to Rishi Sunak and says, hold on, we want a similar arrangement, what should he do?
Well, what has happened today is that the position of Northern Ireland within the UK single market has been immeasurably strengthened. And the other side of that coin is that the Northern Ireland can continue to benefit from access to the EU single market, but without having EU control over its VAT, the ingredients of its sausages or whatever. So Northern Ireland is enjoying the best of both worlds,
and other parts of the country might want the same.
Well, I don't see that best of both worlds has ever been on offer from the European Union, because that might have been a negotiating position during the Brexit talks, but the EU was always adamant that it wouldn't compromise its single market position, and that's why it might be an attractive idea for Scotland to be able to get access to the EU single market in the same way as Northern Ireland has. But that's not on the agenda, because the EU won't countenance it, because they wouldn't allow us to determine our own VAT and our own internal rules, whilst at the same time having access to their market, which I think is a pity.
OK, Christopher, thank you. Right, let's move on from Brexit, at least for a moment. Text question here from Pauline in Watford, who asked the panel, if energy experts are correct in saying that the Tory-backed closure of natural gas storage sites in 2017 has partly led to the massive profits being posted by British gas owner Centrica, can it really be right for the government to be drastically cutting energy bill support in a month's time? This is the broader point, of course. Many of these companies making record profits, billions of pounds a quarter, while people are paying through their teeth in higher and higher energy bills. Ryan, is that fair?
That's a very good question. I mean, energy bills are very high, obviously, at the moment. And then in April, the support is being withdrawn. I think the government will probably have to look again at what sort of support is in place. I think one thing to note, though, is that we've obviously been very dependent on gas for a long time, and the price of gas is very subject to what is happening in Europe, and a lot of Europe is subject or dependent, has been, on Russian gas. So I think the long-term strategy, there's a short-term strategy about protecting consumers through the energy price cap, but I think there's a long-term strategy about reducing our dependency on gas, and making sure that we support alternatives which are low carbon and less prone to geopolitical risk. So things like particularly wind, solar, also nuclear, and making sure that we have homegrown energy, so there's energy security, but also decarbonised energy, because I think both of those things are essential for being less reliant on unstable, unpredictable, countries like Russia.
But in the short term, you think the government is going to have to do more to help with people's bills?
I think that's probably the case, yeah.
Hilary?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely appalling that we are seeing these gas companies make record profits. I mean, Centrica, who own British Gas, have just announced £3 billion in profits. That's triple their profits, while people's energy bills in this country are going up all the time, and as we heard today, are due to go up even more. So what we really need to be talking about is longer term. We can't keep papering over the cracks. We should be talking about renationalising our energy sector and having public ownership. And we know that really, generally, about 66% of the population pretty consistently supports public ownership. And if you look at, for instance, EDF, who are a French state-owned energy company who also supply British households, they in France capped the price rise of their energy bills at 4%, and they've just raked in £1.2 billion in UK profits. So we've got a state-owned energy company in France making profits off of UK households. So we have to, as I said, you can talk about short-term support from the government. Of course, that is a need in this country. We are seeing that absolutely people cannot afford the energy bills as they are, but we have to be talking about a longer-term solution, which should involve public ownership.
How are those sorts of figures justifiable, Sir Christopher?
Well, the figures speak for themselves. And one of the consequences of having high commodity prices is that the people who are providing those commodities tend to make more money at the time when those commodity prices are high. When those prices fall, then who's going to share the losses? So what we do as a country is we say, well, if you make profits, then you pay tax on those profits, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So because those profits are high, there's going to be more tax revenue arising from those profits. But the old sort of leftist recipe of nationalise it, that's not going to work, because what we need to do is we need to attract private sector investment into new sources of gas, particularly from the North Sea. And we know that even the windfall taxes, which were announced as a sort of rather populist gimmick by the government, in my view, that has resulted in companies saying we're not going to invest in the North Sea in the way that we had been planning to do, because the government is showing itself to be inconsistent in its support or otherwise for those investments. So let's face up to the reality. If we want to have our natural resources exploited by entrepreneurs, then let's give them the opportunity of doing it, and don't let's tax them too much.
On that point, Hilary, what would you say to Christopher?
I mean, that's right. If you want an economy that works for the 1%, essentially, I mean, that is what you're advocating for. We have an economy that is just not working for the majority of people in this country. And you cannot continue this trend of having exponential growth for a very, very small number of people. And so we have got to look at massive redistribution of wealth in this country and start making it work for the working people. That's what I have to argue for.
Claire Hanna.
Yeah, well, quite clearly, years of not taking steps, because it's about things that were and weren't done in 2017 on energy security, and in that I include security from catastrophic climate change are bearing out, and I think Hilary is right. The kind of marketisation of energy certainly hasn't benefited everybody. It hasn't benefited the public. It hasn't seen any real steps towards a transition to a greener economy. So basically, the public and the state are on the hook for all the bad bits, and a small number of shareholders are reaping all of the good bits, and that's clearly both not achieving anything approaching equality, but it's also not creating a sustainable infrastructure. This infrastructure is absolutely essential for every aspect of life, so it does seem bizarre to me that is all left in the hands of a small number of people.
Right, and is that something you'd support? We have, as Hilary's pointed out, we have state-run companies from other European states active in providing energy here in the UK. Why shouldn't we have a UK one?
Well, I think it depends on the particular market. I mean, I sympathise with what Christopher says, is that you need private sector investment to make risky decisions and innovations. And actually, some private sector investment has led to some green growth and some investments in green energy, particularly, for example, in renewables. And offshore wind in this country, is I think we're the number one country now for offshore wind, and that's been helped by private sector investment. But of course, when it's painful for people to be able to heat their own homes and the energy costs are so burdensome, then yes, the state has a role to play. So we have to decide what's more economical. Is it having nationalised energy companies, or is it having a kind of mixture of tax supports, benefit support for people on low incomes to be able to manage their energy costs? And at the moment, the costs are very high, and the state is having a big burden for that. But that's not always the case.
OK, lots more to come. A reminder, 0345 60 60 973, the number to call to put your question to the panel. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. Lots more questions coming in. We'll put those to our panellists in just a moment. First, though, 8:33 the time. Let's get the latest news headlines. Tim Humphrey.
The Prime Minister says a new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland secures the country's place in the United Kingdom. Rishi Sunak has told the Commons the Windsor framework that he has unveiled today solves many of the problems with past arrangements. The DUP have said that although progress has been made, key issues of concern remain. The amount energy suppliers can charge customers is to fall by almost £1,000. Ofgem have announced the new cap, but bills are still likely to rise by around £500 a year because of government support being reduced. And Lidl has become the latest supermarket to put limits on some fruit and veg items. Bad weather in North Africa is being blamed for shortages. LBC weather dry for most tonight with some showers in eastern areas, a low of -4.
This is LBC.
8:36 is the time. Welcome back to Cross Question. I'm Ben Kentish. With me in the studio on our panel tonight, Sir Christopher Chope, the Conservative MP for Christchurch and a former government minister. Claire Hanna is here, SDLP MP for Belfast South. Ryan Shorthouse, the founder and chief executive of the centre-right think tank Bright Blue. And also Hilary Schan, the co-chair of Momentum. If you've got a question or a point you want to put to the panel, the number you need is 0345 6060 973. Call us on that number, you will get through. Someone who's done exactly that is Linda in Brighton. Linda, good evening.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask the panel, everyone that I've heard so far has been saying that this Northern Ireland deal could be moving to people in, I don't know, Scotland, England, saying, well, we would like an economic deal with the EU. And I just wanted to ask the panel, basically, we started off as the EEC, and as far as the B word, Brexit, we've always bucked against any kind of trying to control us to either take on the euro, for example, the Maastricht Treaty. We've always bucked against all the issues around sovereignty. So,
what's your question, Linda?
Will the panel think that it is a good idea for us to go back to an economic situation with the EU? I know they don't want to, but I wanted to ask the panel, do they think that we could do it? Thank you.
So closer economic ties without some of the sort of loss of sovereignty that Leave voters didn't like. I think that's the question. Claire?
Well, I come from a region that has fared very badly under sovereignty ultras, people who believe that everybody has to be this and everybody is that, Irish or British. And the Good Friday Agreement was about softening a lot of those lines and making it matter less whether you look to London or Dublin or about borders and all that. And it took a lot of inspiration from the European Union. The French can still be French and the Germans can still be Germans, but in their common interest, they pool their sovereignty and they work together in things that are of mutual benefit to them. And they keep their own agency over things within the nation state. I think that's a pretty good model. I appreciate that I have a different experience of other people. I think the discourse got very, very poisoned in this part of the world during the Brexit years, and that sort of sharing and pooling became a dirty word for very many people. So as I say, it's not really for me to say. I don't represent Britain, but I think closer economic working is, as I said earlier, an absolute no-brainer. I think, in this big bad world that we live in, alliances are made and the world, whether we like it or not, does form into blocks. So I think political engagement and cooperation on big issues, like China, like Russia, like energy are important as well. And I think the closer that Britain can work with the EU, the better for its sake and for the world.
Sir Christopher?
Well, we started off with a common market, didn't we? That was how we began our relationship with what is now known as the European Union. And then gradually they wanted to create a political union. And instead of it being a common market where you had mutual recognition of different people's positions, it became a single market where it was homogenous, everything had to be the same, and it was all controlled from the centre, and that resulted in a loss of sovereignty and the loss of individual countries to be able to control their own destiny, which is then why the British people decided that they'd had enough and they were leaving, because they didn't want to be part of a United States of Europe. So I think in a sense the questioner answered her own question, because she said the EU won't have this and the EU won't have it. So however much we might have liked to have had a common market and still have had a common market.
There are countries with close economic ties to the EU without being in it, Norway, Switzerland, those sorts of models. Is that something we should explore?
Well, we tried to explore it, and funnily enough, I mean, the Swiss, which is a good example, what is happening now is that the EU is continuing to try and control the Swiss and to make new deals with the Swiss conditional upon acceptance of more of the EU rulebook. And the same is true of other countries which are slightly semi-detached from the European Union. The European Union is inherently aggressive and wants to take over other countries' interests and economies. And that's what we resisted, and now we fought back against it, and we're now free to do
you can
our
only
own
do
thing.
that with those countries express approval. It doesn't go invading countries and taking them over like Russia does.
But it did it gently, without, just subtly, didn't it? Because it gradually moved from being a common market. Most people supported the idea of a common market, but then they suddenly woke up and found that we were talking about the United States of Europe, where they hadn't got any control, and you didn't even have the power of veto. It was majority voting on all things. So if a lot of other countries voted against you, you hadn't got anything you could do to defend yourself.
Okay. Right, it seems to me that both main parties at the moment, their leaders are almost so terrified of being seen to betray the referendum result that there's not the scope or the space for a sort of serious, pragmatic, sensible conversation about what a beneficial relationship with the EU looks like. Is that fair?
I think that's right. My personal view is that in 10 years' time we'll be in a different place, and that Britain should join and try and lead an economic union rather than be part of the political union that Christopher describes. At the moment, there is the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, to which Norway, Switzerland, Iceland is involved in. And you have a kind of, for a long time, a lot of people in and around Europe have talked about a two-speed Europe. Those who want to federalise quickly, be part of the union, and the political movement on the union to be in the kind of inner core, so France, Germany, those sorts of countries. And then you have a kind of slower tier. My personal view is that it would be in the interests of the UK to try and make that outer tier, which is less interested in federalising in the political union, and through EFTA. But I think there would have to be two fundamental reforms. The first is around accepting free movement. I think there would have to be a change in that for the UK to seriously consider being part of EFTA. And the second is to strengthen the powers that those countries have over single market rules. At the moment, most of them are rule takers rather than rule makers. They do, I think, throughout when regulation is being made, they have a certain say and an influence in particular forums, but I think that should be strengthened. And if those things are strengthened, then yes, I think we should go back to what most people voted for when they joined the common market, which was for an economic rather than political union. And I think it would be in the UK's long-term interest to lead that and shape that, but in the 2030s.
Hilary, I suspect most of your members, most Labour Party members, would agree with everything Ryan just said, even if they would ideally go even further. Why do you think Keir Starmer isn't making a case for that sort of relationship, and do you think he should?
I mean, I think the thing is that the mess that the Conservatives have made of this over the last few years has made that conversation almost impossible, like you said. But I think the thing that's really important to acknowledge here as well is that we don't get to pick and choose this. We can have these conversations till we're blue in the face, but, the reality of the decision that this country made means that we don't get to pick and choose these things. The reality of this so-called sovereignty on leaving the EU is that we still are at the mercy of the EU to some extent. They are our closest trading partners, as we've seen today. And so when we kind of have these conversations about should we make the argument for this, should we make the argument for that, we don't actually get to pick and choose that at the moment. We've kind of got to get on with it and make the best of a bad deal.
Linda, in a sentence, if you would, wonder what you make of what you just heard.
Yes, well, I think the point is that we want the economics to work, but we don't particularly want, and have never, because obviously history shows it, we don't particularly want to have the euro. We don't want to have any particular ties with any kind of restrictions that we don't want.
But
Claire,
it
just
is,
very briefly,
worth
if you would.
saying, the social aspects of Europe have been hugely beneficial for this place as well, and the environmental protections and the workers' protection. So it wasn't just about trade; it raised the level of protection for people on the planet as well. All of those rights haven't been secured; they are still for the chopping block under a piece of legislation that's going through at the moment. They could all fall off the book, and I think we'll know all about it if those protections disappear. And I'm not confident they'll be replaced by the current government.
Okay, thank you all. More questions to come in just a moment. This is LBC. I'm Ben Kentish. The time now, 8:47.
LBC.
$8:49 is the time, and Robert in Bristol has texted with a question for our panel. He says, was it appropriate for the King to be involved in the Brexit talks today? Some DUP MP, some Tories like Jacob Rees-Mogg criticising the government for, as they put it, effectively politicising this by implicitly getting King Charles to endorse Rishi Sunak's deal by holding that meeting with Ursula von der Leyen. Is that criticism fair, Christopher Chope?
I don't think so, actually. I think that you've got the president of the European Union in town, the King's in town at the same time, and if they want to meet up, then let them meet up. And I don't think it's anything for the politicians to interfere with, frankly.
You don't feel it is unfairly dragging King Charles into politics?
I don't think he would allow himself to be dragged into politics unfairly.
Interestingly, the Palace made pretty clear that this was a government request and recommendation. Ryan, was it appropriate?
Well, the question was it appropriate for the King to be involved in the Brexit talks? He wasn't involved in the Brexit talks. He met the President of the EU, and as head of state, that's an appropriate thing to do. Obviously, it coincided with the launch of the Windsor Agreement, but I think the criticisms are far-fetched, to be honest. I think it seems appropriate for the head of state to meet the EU President.
OK. Claire Hanna.
It's fair to say that I have what you might call a polite interest in the royal family, and I've never set myself up as any sort of expert on protocol. But I think, as the others have said, it's nothing untoward. Ursula von der Leyen is a significant political figure, and other figures of her stature would routinely, I think, meet the king, who, as Christopher said, is well able to look after himself and not be politicised where he doesn't wish to be.
Agreement so far. Hilary, you got to ruin it?
I have to disagree with that, I'm afraid.
Go on.
I don't think Rishi Sunak was hanging out in Windsor coincidentally. And, it seems to me that this was an attempt by the government to sort of shore up their credibility with the unionists where they may be lacking it elsewhere. And no, I don't think it's ever appropriate for an unelected head of state to be involved in any political talks.
OK, thank you for your question, Robert. Another text question is from Tom in Walthamstow, who asks this. Keir Starmer has been schmoozing business leaders today in the City of London, with one of them donating £2 million to the party. Is this rejuvenated Labour Party more capitalist than ever before? Christopher Chope.
Well, I must say I'm rather against big donations to political parties, because I think political parties at their best are a mass
Your party's taken enough of them.
Well, I've been pretty critical of them as well, because what has happened in the Conservative Party is that our mass membership has declined significantly, and as a result, we've got less grassroots involvement and activity and less wisdom coming from the grassroots, which can be listened to by the government and the leaders of the party. So I'm against big donations and parties becoming dependent upon big donations, and I like to see a lot more active involvement, much higher membership of all political parties amongst ordinary people.
OK, Hilary.
Well, I didn't expect to be agreeing with Christopher this evening, but I do have real problems with big donations to political parties. And I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Keir Starmer has been talking about trying to get rid of vested interests in politics at the very same time as announcing these big money donors coming back into the party. So, I find it incredibly concerning. We are supposed to be a member-led democratic party, and having the influence of big money donors instead of that grassroots influence from the membership about what they want to see from the party and the policies and direction that members want to see. This is it's a concerning turn of events.
Why is Labour accepting money from successful business leaders and successful businessmen and women? Why is that a bad thing?
It's a bad thing because for exactly that reason. For instance, you see, in the Conservative Party, but also in the States, when you get big money donors putting money into political parties, of course, they then expect some control of the agenda. And so once again, you get that top percentage of very small percentage of people who are dictating the political direction of the parties and the government. And when that happens, you do not get the interests of the working people served. You get the interests of the very few at the top served. And so, it's bad for democracy and it's bad for working people.
But the money's coming back in. Labour's 20% or so ahead in the polls. People like Luciana Berge are reading under the party. It must be doing something right, Keir Starmer.
Yeah, don't underestimate, though, that the performance of Labour in the polls is also very much down to the complete implosion and disastrous Tory government that we've seen as well. So I don't think it's a time for complacency. And look, the thing is with what Keir Starmer's talking about at the moment, he's talking about, the failed economic system. He's right in that. But his solutions don't match the diagnosis. What we need to be seeing is a much bolder approach. And when he talks about growth, well, who is he talking about growth for? Because if you are still talking about growing the pie, but that new growth still only goes to the top percentage of earners, well, then we're not actually tackling the fundamental problem.
Okay. Ryan, how do you rate Keir Starmer's performance? I think the text question suggested that he's taking Labour too far to the right.
Well, just to this point that if you receive a donation, then the donor will get what they want is not necessarily the case, for example, with the Conservatives, where corporation tax is being increased and a lot of businesses say that's
quite a lot of them end up in the House of Lords.
So I think, let's not be cynical about the role that donations play in terms of them dictating what happens in government policy. That isn't the case. In terms of Keir Starmer's strategy, I think it's clear that it's quite successful in terms of reassuring people who want a market system, who believe that capitalism is not perfect, but it is the best way of, creating jobs and creating opportunities for people. That, I think, is working. My own view is that businesses see low growth and high taxation under a Conservative government, and therefore feel that it's not representing the dynamic economy that they want, so are looking for alternatives like Labour. Look, I think what we really need to do is shift. There's lots of things we can do to support businesses and growth, but one very good thing we could do is shift the weight of taxation away from employment, either through people's wages or through corporation tax, onto wealth. That is income that is derived from pensions, from rent, from other assets. I think we need to shift the weight of taxation away, and therefore we can lower taxation on work, on employment, on corporates, and do it towards income that's derived from more luck and unproductive parts of the economy.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Claire Hanna.
I think, and I wish it wasn't the case, but fighting elections is an increasingly expensive business. I represent a small party, and we try to do it, the traditional way with shoe leather and with small donations. But there is a massive inequality of arms in elections that is favouring parties with big resources. I'm a social democrat, and I believe in the possibility of rewarding enterprise and in social change. I don't know who this donor is and how they made that money, but I think it's a positive thing to put it into creating social change. I also believe in transparency and regulation of donations, but crucially in pushing and improving participation. I'd say far less than 1% of the population is involved in the boring business of democracy, of fighting elections, and that's a big problem. And the more that we can, improve politics and create tone that gets people back involved, that will reduce the weighting of big donors. But I will say that I think this country and Northern Ireland need a Labour government, and that will mean an election will have to be fought. And I support Labour doing within the moral and legal frameworks, doing what they need to do to win that election.
They're your sister party.
They are indeed.
Yeah. Do you feel more affinity with them under Keir Starmer, Claire, than you did under Jeremy Corbyn?
I've been a member of the SDLP for longer than I care to remember, through many, and the relationships have waxed and waned, sometimes depending on our own. Certainly there was years that we didn't have MPs here, and our relationship faded. We're interested in getting things like a pragmatic outcome for Northern Ireland and Brexit. We're interested in any leader that respects.
But do you think Keir Starmer's doing a better job as leader of your sister party than Jeremy Corbyn did?
I did. I must say I wasn't an MP at the time. I had frustrations with Jeremy Corbyn over Brexit and what I saw as a failure to see the existential threat that it faced to Northern Ireland, and not taking some of the early steps. And I believe some of the turmoil that we've had for the last 5 or 6 years could have been nipped in the bud earlier, before or in the immediate years after the Brexit negotiations. And I regret that Labour didn't play more active. But obviously we have common cause on many issues as well.
Okay, final text question. So very briefly.
Just look what happened under Jeremy Corbyn in terms of participation in democracy, though. You had a trebling of membership. Yep. When a bold radical policy programme was put to the country, you had hundreds of thousands of people joining them.
But you lost 2 elections.
But consistently, when actually people were polled on the domestic policies, they consistently performed well. And actually in 2017, we had the biggest rise in vote share since.
Very quickly, just in a word, we have a final text question from Sarah in High Wycombe, who says, we lost the marvellous Betty Boothroyd today. Who is the most straight-talking person the panel know in the world of politics? Ryan.
Oh, gosh. You had to come to me first. The most straight talking.
Right, let's go. We'll get to him in the meantime.
I think I would have to go for John McDonnell. I have always found him to be incredibly straight talking, and he's, I think, one of the boldest and best economic minds of our time.
Christopher Chope.
Well, actually, I think Jeremy Corbyn's very straight talking, and let's not forget that Jeremy Corbyn helped deliver Brexit.
I did not expect you to say that, I must say. Ryan.
Oh, gosh.
You're still thinking. Let's
I think I've brought Christopher on side.
It's a really hard question. I'm going to go for some clever get out that it isn't always straight talking. It's weighing up things. Do you know who I'm a big admirer of? Somebody she wasn't. I didn't cross over. Sylvia Herman, who was an independent unionist MP from Northern Ireland, and somebody who I thought chose her words carefully, represented a wide diversity of people. Wasn't always the quickest to a microphone, but had a big impact.
Have you thought of anyone?
I've got one.
He's got one.
I've got one. I had to think deeply about it. I think David Davis actually is quite a plain talking person. I found him to be quite thoughtful and not tribal on every issue.
We're out of time. Thank you so much to a panel of Christchurch, Chope, Hilary, Schan, Ryan Shorthouse and Claire Hanna from the SDLP. Thank you for your questions. Coming up, we are going to carry on talking about Northern Ireland because so many of you want to talk about it. It is a historic day. I think that is undeniable. We've heard a lot from guests on this new deal. We've heard a lot what people think it reflects about Rishi Sunak and the government. All the experts have had their say, but I want to hear more from you. Call now. Tell me what you think of today's event. Is it the success for Rishi Sunak that the government and indeed many on our panel think that it is? Has it changed your view of him? And has it changed where you are on Brexit? Do you think actually under this new agreement, this new dawn in Northern Ireland, things are looking up? Perhaps the decision to leave wasn't quite as bad as maybe you thought it was after all.